Hello. Welcome to another episode of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. Each week we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season we're going to be focusing on horror subgenres and how they've changed over time. Hope you enjoy it, and thanks for listening. I'm not going to say I wanted to do this movie again, but I understand why it was important.
It's your idea.
I know.
I would like to let the people know. I did not make this choice. I just agreed and left the call. I was just like, yeah, I was like, okay.
Just heavily suggested that it was the right thing to do, and I couldn't argue with you.
No. I was just like, are you sure? I was like, okay. All right.
So anybody who's listened to any previous episodes of this probably knows I'm not a big fan of the movie Scream.
Yeah.
But we are currently doing a miniseries deep dive on how slasher movies have developed over time. And it would be wrong to try and tell that story without talking about Scream.
100. We have to. And so the idea of what we kind of came up with is that we're going to have with Scream, but we also want to talk about those characteristics of slasher films too.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a quick recap to talk about how we got from Friday the 13th and the golden age of slashers, which we talked about last week, to the mid 90s when Scream came out and why it was so successful. So I'm going to do a quick recap on that, and then you can give us some info on sort of a little bit of the background that you need to understand like a lot of the comedy and cleverness in the writing of Scream that is rooted very much in those, I guess you'd say, tropes of the golden age of slashers.
I'm speechless. You said what you said.
And then I'm just going to let you talk the rest of the time because I don't want to think about Scream anymore.
I can do.
Yep. So last week we talked about Friday the 13th, Golden Age of Slashers. That lasted from around the time that Halloween came out in 1978 until 1984 when A Nightmare on Elm Street premiered. After that, budgets for slashers got smaller, and although there were some flashes like Chucky and Candyman, they mostly failed to find long-term success with sequels. And the genre in general really kind of stagnated. Filmmakers kept trying to cash in on the formerly successful franchises, but even the Friday the 13th and Halloween sequels couldn't get people into the theaters as time went on. Outside the US, there were definitely some original slasher movies that did well, but in general, the pop culture influence of the subgenre had hit an all-time low, and it really just didn't feel exciting, and people were more interested in action movies and thrillers. Movies like RoboCop, The Terminator, Die Hard, and all of their sequels dominated the box office in the late 80s and early 90s. Slashers felt like outdated relics of a bygone era. So it was really kind of surprising when Wes Craven came along and put out an absolute blockbuster with Scream in 1996. This was surprising because at that point, what felt more stale and overdone and boring than a slasher movie? But by making a very meta movie that exercised all the tropes of slashers while also calling them out and kind of making fun of them, using well-known actors and basically establishing many of the new tropes that successful teen movies of the late 90s and early 2000s would cash in on, somehow he found a box office success. And somehow he also re-energized a subgenre that had been bleeding out for almost a decade. So one thing you'll notice almost immediately if you watch this movie is how heavily it references the common themes in Golden Age slashers. And it points out their rules pretty explicitly. And it does that in a way where it follows the rules, but also makes fun of the rules and acknowledges that it's following the rules in a way that makes just a really unique movie experience in horror. And yeah, that's about all I got to say about it. So would you like to talk about what those rules of slasher movies are?
Yeah. I'd like to start off by saying RoboCop's one of my favorite films. I just thought let everyone know. So the thing with Scream is there's kind of two routes. Basically, they're saying like, "Hey, we know the game. We know you know the game." It's kind of a straightforward approach to this. So, and when we say we know the game, well, what's the game? Well, it's the characteristics that you kind of have in horror films. So or in slasher films. So one of the things that we did in research for these episodes was like we noticed that basically a lot of the ones that stuck around as far as popularity or had the most like financial success, they stuck to rules. They stuck to these rules and for the most part. So Friday the 13th is a really good example. It's an isolated setting, so summer camp, prom, basically somewhere where there's no adults, maybe young adults, but no adults, except for the crazy guy that's telling everyone they're going to die. There's kind of like iconic point of view shots. So at the beginning of Friday the 13th, since we just did that episode last week, at the beginning, it's like you're the killer. You're looking through their eyes. Halloween is really popular with this as well. There's obviously a few other films out there with it. You kind of have like a final girl, virgin heroine. Virgin's kind of a key for that as well. It seems like the ones that have sex are the ones that die. I don't know why. It's just the rules. Now, specifically with Scream, like the rules that they say, you can never have sex. Just rules. You can never drink. You can never do drugs. So that's the second rule. Number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstance, say, "I'll be right back," because you won't be back. Those are just the standard rules that slashers kind of stuck to in a way. There are definitely more elements of slashers that we could talk about. I saw a lot of stuff about being stranded. I kind of looped that all in with isolated settings, basically. Jump scares is another one that is a big thing with this. Technically, thinking of like the episode 2 weeks ago, there was the jump scare at the beginning. I don't know. I feel like like Conjuring films are worse with those. I'm not a fan of those of jump scares, for the record. I don't like to be scared. It's part of it. Illogical thinking. This is a big part of slasher film. This is why you're screaming at the screen. Why are you running upstairs? It's illogical. That's why. It's part of the characteristics of horror films. Obviously, killer resurrections for all the sequels that come up, and then final. It doesn't always have to be like this, but cliffhangers. It's kind of a big thing. So you think of like Halloween. They look down, he's gone after at the very end. If that spoiled it, the movie came out in the 70s. I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, so these are kind of I'm going to say Scream started calling them rules. I think what they kind of considered before was characteristics. I don't know if like anyone was like, I don't know, because this movie came out in 96 and I was only 23 at the time. And so I was pretty young, but no, I was really 8, I think. But you would hear like references to summer camp or about horror films or yelling at the screen, "Why are you going upstairs?" But I don't know if it was ever really defined like Scream did it, which is the real reason why we decided to throw that in to this week. Because if there's a movie that out there that, yet again, they own it, they own it, and or we know it, we know that you know it. That's what this film's about. So they're owning up to like, hey, yeah, we do have these rules, and we're still going to kind of stick to them, but we're going to come at it with a different angle. So,
yeah, figuring out a way to take all of those predictable elements and then present them in a way that is still feels like fresh and exciting and scary to a new generation, I think is sort of what this movie was aiming to do, and obviously pulled off because the results speak for themselves.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out there is something that is not a characteristic of slashers, and that's all the sequels. That's just capitalism. I don't know what to tell you. People just who doesn't want to make money? I would do it in a heartbeat. I would like to make that very clear. If I could make a film and just have $1 million, I would do it without a doubt. But like, let's put it to a movie that you like. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So that's they're deserted and stranded at this house. It's in the middle of Erie country, in Texas. And the movie's kind of short, so it's over kind of a short period of time as well, like a day and a half, kind of condensing the action, making it pretty intense. Obviously, the famous ending scene where the main female character survives, kind of leaves it as a cliffhanger in a way because the Leatherface is still there. The other thing too is with weapons. So slashers, that's why you have the knives and chainsaw, obviously from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's kind of the iconic Freddy glove. That's like part of it.
The fake knife from this one.
Yeah, the fake knives. Yeah, for sure. Kind of a smaller group in a way. What was it, like 5 of them, I think? I think there's 5 in this. Another piece of it too is I wanted to bring this up because of Friday the 13th, but the communication. So like what we said last week, where all these, they thought the kids were out making out. There's no communication there. And that's just going to lead to mayhem. You should always communicate. Unless it's with me, I don't want to talk to you. Then you have, just, I don't know how you can like plan this, but like classic endings. Like I can see the ending of Texas Chainsaw Massacre in my head right now. It just stands there. I referenced Halloween just a few minutes ago. Like it's pretty iconic. We talked about the mom doing the dual vocals, and you had that really cool idea or the thought with Psycho reference there, kind of reversed. I feel like that easily fits into this as well. Now, does Scream have that? I don't know, but for the most part, those are the characteristics of these slashers. I also have more slashers if you wanted me to go through them, but just for the sake of time, I'm not. I won't.
So I'm going to say something that may surprise you.
Yeah, it was better this time around.
I found things to appreciate about this movie this time around.
Oh, nice.
I still don't like it. I still think most of the characters were so annoying, but there were things that I did appreciate. And I think that while this movie was definitely calling out horror movie tropes and like using that in kind of like a dark comedy way a lot of times, there were also things that it did where it was like taking a thing from the formula or taking a thing that was established by previous movies in the genre and then doing them really well without calling it out specifically, that demonstrated sort of a mastery of the subgenre. And I think the very first example of that is the 13-minute opening scene.
Yeah.
I think that a thing that, we kind of all can immediately call to mind a million examples of is a horror movie that has the super intense opening sequence followed by sort of a reset that then goes into more of like a slow burn on building up to the horror. I think a good example, calling back, that we saw and talked about last week was with Friday the 13th, where the original killing at the camp with the 2 teenagers in, I think it was like the late 50s, that sort of was the beginning of everything else that happened in it. That was a good example of that, opening scene and then resetting, and then the girl is going through the town and she's hearing about how, oh yeah, things are going to be bad out there. It's Camp Blood. It's where murder and weird things happen. And that really starting off by showing very visible and very like graphic violence set the scene for making all of those things a lot more intense and engaging than if that opening scene hadn't been there. And I think that this movie has that as well, with like the very iconic murder and then, stringing Drew Barrymore up and her parents finding the body and stuff. Like that went hard right off the bat. And that really took its time with getting the most out of that scene and making it as effective as possible. Mm-hmm. And I think that paid off through the whole rest of the movie, because you already knew the stakes were high. You already knew that like the consequences of any wrong move was a very violent, bloody, and painful murder.
Right. I think that it kind of adds to it being that, they're supposed to be in high school. And then after you figure out that like these are, high school kids that are doing this, like that's in a way, I feel like almost a little bit more brutal because, the world hasn't had the time to kick them in the ass quite yet. Yeah. Like it does when you become an adult. When a Stranger Calls is obviously the first thing I thought of. With the beginning part, kind of homage to it. But you got to respect, because at the beginning, like at the very beginning in the call, they're talking about, tricking or they're talking about horror films and stuff, and that's obviously what this movie's about. I've only said it 1,000 times. The other thing I've missed though for the characteristics was the over the top killing. Doesn't always happen for sure, like you're not gonna have that every time, but like a prime example is the intro to Scream. Like you're saying, hung up, like that's brutal. Like that's the not just that is brutal, the like kind of dragging yourself, because your safety is right there. Her parents were right there and she was trying to get them. Like that is adding to the brutality of the killing too.
And I think that really goes back to Giallo. Yeah. I mean, that's really where they just kind of, the whole scene was set up around making this super extra brutal, effective kill shot. And that's the thing, obviously that we saw basically the whole pace and setup of Friday the 13th was just around setting up those scenes. And this movie definitely embraced that as well as part of what it was doing. Yeah. And I also think this one, even though like all the movies that they were calling out specifically by name were sort of in that golden age of slashers, I really do think this one had a lot of influences from movies that were even older than that. And so another one that I think came from, the Giallo movement was it had a lot of very deliberate misdirects as to who the killer was. And the whole thing about everyone being a suspect and everyone sort of thinking it could have been that person, it could have been the artist who ate the cats, or it could have been, Billy or whatever, is just like, oh, that's straight from the way that, Giallo told stories around killers.
Yeah, and I think something about this one too, if you kind of think about it, like definitely misdirect, obviously. Like this film is just misdirect on misdirect. So much so it gets frustrating. However, one of the people who they initially make you think it is the killer, and it's like,
yes.
So like they played on those rules too to kind of
the misdirect.
Yeah. So it was definitely like a mind game, and yet again, this has, obviously we know, but like if anyone else were to put this film out, I would definitely think that these people did their math. Like they know they're fans, and that's what I think as fans of horror films, that's what we want. Like you want to see them made by fans, but you also want the new people too, so you can get cool movies. But you know what I mean? Like why not make them? Yeah.
Yes, there were a billion things in this movie that showed that the people who made it were very familiar with and appreciated, horror movies of the past. Is Loomis the most common last name for a character in a horror movie?
Well, that's ties to the Halloween. Yeah, to Halloween. Yeah.
But also
Wes Craven.
Psycho, right?
Isn't that the homage that they did with Halloween? Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. I said to Halloween. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So it's just it feels like this movie is trying very deliberately to place itself in that same lineage, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I liked it. Yeah, I think that when you I think the 90s, if I were just to kind of dissect your frustration with it, I would almost say it's like the 90s. Like one of the reasons why I like 80s action, like RoboCop, because it's just over the top and brutal, and like you have street gang members that, are just like skinny white guys,
Right,
that aren't intimidating at all, kind of thing.
Yeah, the 90-pound kid wearing the jacket with the cutoff sleeves.
Yeah. Well, I think like two days in a row, like I text you like movies that you should watch based on the fact that they both had like a young Jeff Goldblum in them. Like, and he was like a bad guy, it's like right. Jeff Goldblum. That's the same, the guy that they were trying to make like a punk. But I think it's the 90s. Like, I feel like one of the things I like about the 90s so much is one of the things that you're not. It's just the way that they thought high school was in the 90s. Even we don't know, but just maybe that's how it was. But like, yeah, I blame it on the 90s. I'm just saying there was a lot of fun in the 80s, and it was ruined when grunge came on. That's what my dad always said about hair metal. I swear to God.
I can't argue.
He said, look, all they wanted to do was drink and party. And all of a sudden you had these guys coming from Seattle and they're all bummed out. And now everything's sad. And I was like, you're blaming everything on grunge, Dad? He's like, yeah. And I was like, all right, man, say less.
I mean, I get it.
He has a hatred for Nirvana, dude. I swear to God.
Don't even bring up Pearl Jam in his presence.
Oh, God, no.
Yeah, this one too. I had a section in my notes of like things from this one that really were similar to Friday the 13th, but I think it's probably bigger than that. I think it's just recency bias because we watched that movie. But one of the things was interesting how no one knew that they were like slowly getting killed off for so long. Like so many of the characters were oblivious to it. Mm-hmm. And then later the survivors start finding the bodies, and that adds to the terror sort of as you're getting towards the climax of the movie. But did you have like favorite scenes in this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I still stick by like the killing by the garage door, even though unrealistic. Yeah. It's still like, well, I think when we were
the intensity of it
exactly, and I think that's what we talked about initially when we recorded was like, I just like the idea, like they were just kind of coming up with a new, like almost like they had like how to die on a wall, and they were throwing darts. And someone put like by a garage door. So I would definitely say that. I think also like when they're in the house at the end watching the movie and they're going over the rules.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's the start of the mayhem. I'm not a huge fan of Dewey, like them kind of going away from there, but like, because they go off anyway. Gail and Dewey go off. I'm not a huge fan of that. I don't know why. I just think it was kind of dumb because they're supposed to be protecting people in the house. So starting with the killings that are happening in the news van on, I was pretty big fan of as well. But there's something very creepy about the calls. Like when the stranger calls this one, even thinking on like the movie Joyride, even though it's on CV radio, like
Candy Cane.
Yeah, just the creepiness of that, it's like seeing eyes through a window, like for me, where it's like creeps me out.
There was one scene kind of earlier on that really stood out to me, and that's when Sydney is in the bathroom by herself and she has that feeling that somebody's there, and she gets down and looks under the stalls like several times, and then the last time she does it, you see the killer's shoes step down from the toilet onto the ground. And just the way, like how slow it was and how deliberate it was and how obvious it was that he was just like screwing with her the whole time. Like that was so creepy, and that's such a, I don't know, just like a weird situation to put yourself in, of thinking you're alone and then finding out that you're not, and the other person is not in a hurry to like surprise you about it or anything. They're just in control. That was a really, I thought, effective scene. Also, it helped that no one was talking, because usually in this movie when people were talking, I was annoyed.
Just by their voice. I can feel you. I feel you on that.
But another thing that kind of annoyed me about this one was people had a really easy time fighting off Ghostface whenever it was convenient to the plot. Like those skinny little high school girls could just like throw him around the room if they needed to get away. Mm-hmm. But then if like somebody was a bigger guy, there was no way he was getting away if they wanted him to die in that moment. Which is probably true with a lot of slasher movies, but it just, because I was already annoyed, it stood out to me in this one more, I think. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I had a problem with that. I think when you watch enough 80s films, you just go along, you just go with the flow. Unless you hate the film and then you start pointing it out. So I understand where you come from. I didn't personally have that, but thinking on this as well, like thinking on the characteristics of Scream, of slashers and Scream, like they definitely, I know I said we know you know the script, we know the game, you know the game, is what I said. But they use that against us, right? So I already used that example earlier, but also the virgin, she had sex and she didn't die. Like she's still going, and it's like Scream 28 now. So they definitely, like, they fooled us, and now I kind of don't like the film because I've been made a fool. I'm with you on this at this point.
Yeah. Well, I think that this one did a few things that kind of broke the mold. And, or not maybe broke the mold, but that sort of tried to branch out a little bit from those tropes. And not even, I guess it goes back to, I feel like this movie was very aware of previous slashers, and it chose when to use them as an influence and when to try and do something on its own. And I think that actually was a big reason why it was so successful. It took a lot of the tactics that are effective in movies, and it did them pretty well. But then it also did things like the characters were aware of horror movies and tropes, just like teenagers in the 90s would have been. Like, they would have all grown up, like anybody going to see this movie in a theater would have grown up, being at least aware of Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers. And so then to go see people who are like them, who also know about horror movies, in the situation of a horror movie, almost would like make it feel more relatable, I think. And I think it also helped that they got known actors. I mean, we had Principal Fonz up in here. Like, horror movies don't have actors that you recognize.
Yeah.
And this was really a time that they did that, which I think was a big part of it being so popular with teenagers and young adults.
Yeah, I mean, it had that gal from Friends. What's her name? Courtney Cox. And that was mid, like, Friends fame.
Yeah,
like that was
already a big deal.
Yeah. So that was like when, the big guys wearing the big sweatshirts was on TV. So yeah, I mean, they definitely changed the game there, which maybe that's the reason why we have a lot more. Another characteristic was like it did of slashers is it gave I don't know how to put this, like, so like Kevin Bacon was in Friday the 13th, right?
Yes.
Is that the guy? Yeah.
A very young Kevin Bacon.
A very young Kevin Bacon. Yeah, he played Jack. Sorry. And obviously we all know Kevin Bacon. There's even, the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So that was kind of a characteristic that you could get your start there. I think that's definitely changed now, where they're a little bit more popular in a way. But also, how can you know who's going to be a star in 10 years?
Yeah. So. Well, and I think definitely now, and really starting with this movie, I can't think of many examples before. Being in a horror movie had, in the past, it came with baggage, right? Like, you weren't getting top talent for horror movies because, one, you probably couldn't get enough money invested in you to afford it, but two, there was a certain stigma that came with it. And so being in sort of a bloody slasher movie, most people would associate that more with, like, an exploitation film or grindhouse stuff, not like proper film acting. But I think that with this movie, you had people who were well known that were in a movie that was really successful, and that kind of normalized it. And so then it doesn't feel like you are lowering yourself to be in a horror movie, because they can make a ton of money and people like money. And, other actors aren't going to look at you funny because you were in one of these movies, or society's not going to judge you as being morally corrupt because you were in a horror movie, or whatever the various reasons were that kept it from happening.
Or like, it doesn't mean that you're a bad actor because you got your start in horror. Like, just think of like recent films. Think about anything Jordan Peele has done.
Exactly. Like absolute blockbusters, super high budget, very well regarded, critically praised. Those are not things that you would say about most horror movies through the course of film history.
Right. And that's, definitely changed. And it could, the resurgence of slasher films could have had something to do with it. Could have, who knows? But overall, though, I kind of like the idea, though, with what they did with Scream, which is, we're not going to try to trick you too much.
Yeah, and I feel like the one thing we didn't dive into here was that this movie was directed by Wes Craven. Mm-hmm. Obviously, huge horror fan, prolific in the genre, was probably the best option at the time to make a movie like this, where it could sort of have this like meta quality of like talking about horror movies while also being a horror movie, and really drawing from that whole history of slasher movies and pulling the things that worked well and would translate well to modern film, while also, kind of keeping the modern elements that would make people excited about it. So I think he is a big reason why this movie was able to be pulled off successfully, because I think there are a lot of directors who wouldn't have done a very good job.
Yeah, without a doubt. This wraps it up for slashers, doesn't it?
What do you mean?
Do we have an episode next week?
Oh, you bet we do.
Oh, are we doing Sergeant Kabuki Man NYPD? You guys,
we did both watch it, but I didn't.
If we ever do like a Q&A, you should ask us about that, because I fell back asswards. I got tricked by myself, and then I tricked you into it unknowingly.
Yeah, that movie is a gem.
I finished it. That's
same.
all I could say.
Yeah. That was a wild ride. But no, we will be back next week with another slasher movie, and to kind of wrap it up. And I am really excited because I feel like so far we've kind of followed like the rise and the high points of slasher movies. And so we, started with Psycho, and then we went to the bird with the something
leather. I can never remember when I was posting that episode. I think I had it pulled up like 10 times.
Yeah. The bird with the crystal plumage.
Yeah, plumage.
And then we did Friday the 13th, and now we've done Scream. And we've been talking about these movies that sort of were at the forefront of the genre, and that were sort of making them popular and getting them in front of lots of people, and leading to the genre being sort of accepted in pop culture. And next week, we're going to come back to a horror movie that just wanted to be a disgusting slasher. Yeah. And that makes me so happy, because the fact that those movies can still get made, and that there are slasher movies being made in the modern time that still have a budget but aren't trying to be like these big Hollywood events, is just right in my lane, and it warms my heart.
I legit forgot that we were doing that. I thought this was the last one. I'm excited now. That's exciting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're coming back.
Hell yeah.
Consider this like we just fell out of a window and off a balcony, and you came out and looked to see us on the ground holding our Scream episode. But, buddy, we weren't there.
Damn. Fucking A, dude. That's all I can say to that. That's a great reference.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.